In this video, we're going to go behind the scenes on the visual effects breakdown for Mortal Kombat. This is part 1 in the 5-part series. We're exploring the fatalities for Mortal Kombat. Throughout this video, we're going to dig deep into deconstructing the visual effects process for the film from the unique perspective of a visual effects supervisor. We'll be discussing the work involved, the techniques, the technology, the process, all of the sequences of the film and how they were created. I'm Allan McKay, I'm a visual effects supervisor in Hollywood. I've been working in the industry for over 25 years at studios like Industrial Light and Magic and dozens of other leading visual effects studios. On projects like Game of Thrones, Transformers, Star Trek, Superman, Avengers Endgame, my goal is to teach artists and creators the skills and the knowledge to be able to build a successful career in the creative industry, as well as the business side of being an artist. This is a 5-part video series. Each day this week I'll be reviewing a new sequence from the film, as well as a compilation of all the effects at the end of the week. The goal is simply to break down and explain the shots and the challenges for each of these sequences, and share my thoughts as a visual effects supervisor on how I would approach these. Typically, we're handed a script and we've got to break down exactly what we need to do and allocate the right studios and the right people to each of these sequences. So this is an opportunity to be able to break down my thoughts on how I would approach a lot of these sequences, as well as discuss a lot of what's involved in the creative process. By the way, if you're enjoying this channel, all the content I make in this channel I make for free, and all I ask in return is if you could please subscribe and like this video. It might not mean much to you, but it'll mean the world to me, and you won't miss out on any of the upcoming content that I release daily. Finally, if there's a particular movie that you want to see covered in the upcoming visual effects breakdowns, let me know. Leave a comment below, I'd love to hear from you. As well as any questions that maybe I haven't covered yet, I'm happy to answer all of those as well. So, let's get started. Okay, so let's dig into this. I did see an article somewhere about Kung Lao's fatality scene being more practical than CGI. And it's just interesting looking through that, because I'm like, I don't think so. I think that almost all of this is CGI. So I think if you look here, this stuff is all practical. So yeah, I mean, maybe they were doing a bunch of stuff on set, and it's more like, let's see what we can actually get in frame. And that's something that we'll typically do a lot. We'll see what we can get in camera if we have the time to prep for it, we got the props and everything else to go and shoot all of that. But sometimes then you're going through dailies and you're like, this isn't really working. And that's when it's time to start looking at other conversations with what can we do in post to augment this or completely replace the way that we're going to do it. And that's another conversation that will come up. It's pretty cool though. So again, you're just doing the sand sim, which again, I feel like you want to match the sand to the same color as the actual sand. But because I'm looking at the lightest areas, it's still relatively not the same color. But maybe you're doing that just to make it stand out, because that's the problem is if you look at the walls and the sand here, because I'm always thinking about the creative notes, right? I'm always thinking before I start like pointing stuff out in someone's work as what they could be doing better, I am always sitting down first and thinking of, well, what is the feedback that, like, what are they being told? Because it's very different. Like, it's very easy to say, well, these aren't the same color, but then you think about it, it's like, well, what are the scenarios they would run into? And the thing is, if you made this sand that's moving around the same color as the ground, you'll notice the walls are the same color as the ground. So most of this would just blend in and look muddy. And therefore you wouldn't see much detail. So that's why I feel like the active particles are a lot more redder. It's just more that they were told, like, let's pump up the brightness a little bit, just to, make it more visible. Me personally, like, the way that I would approach this stuff is exactly here, how it's been done. I would probably create some particulate matter around it. Let's say that's the sand landing on the ground or something, just more CG sand, integrating it all together, because I just feel like this stuff is actually pretty hard. And then, just to get it all to tie in. But this, I'd shoot it all in frame, but I would just do her, Kung Lao, everything CG, personally. And I'd say that's probably the case, but like I said, I'm giving the benefit of the doubt that maybe it just gets CG around this point. But to me, it does look like it's all computer generated. And yeah, so like stuff like this, again, just completely CG. So like I said, it's kind of interesting, but like looking at a shot like this is practical. You got, you know, this freaking blood hose spurting blood all over him. And I wouldn't be surprised still if there is some augmentation going on, so there is like blood being shot on him, but it's like, okay, let's get the stream and get that going. And I partially mentioned that just because, for continuity, like, the motion blur and just the style of blood that you're seeing here, it's identical in this shot too, so I feel like, you know, obviously you want to match it as close to the practical as possible, but I feel like in this case, there is a lot of CG blood that's being added in on top of all the spurts and everything hitting his face. But yeah, so this is the one where, honestly, I'm looking at the body, and at first glance, because out of all the shots, this is really the telltale. I mean, out of all the shots, like, this is really the telltale. It's also the money shot. Like, you don't really care about all this. It's really about seeing that happen, which is just insane. So, the thing is, the body looked pretty real to me at first glance. I'm like, huh, okay, that's a pretty good job. But the head didn't. Like, it looks good. It's just the hair, a few things like that. It's just, it's got a bit of a different look to it, especially the front. But yeah, so at first glance, I'm like, huh, okay, maybe this is real. Just knowing that, like, that headline that kind of, you know, my eye caught one day and kind of stuck with me, that this is all practical. But the thing is, if you look at all the interaction with the sand, that's the interesting thing, because, like, the blood and the way it interacts on the sand here is beautiful. Like, I almost feel like that is practical, just because it... Usually what you do with blood is you'll, you make it, like, really bouncy or move around, and blood and sand, which is one of my favorite drinks, cocktails, blood and sand, but blood in sand, yeah, it just stops. Like, it displaces the sand a little bit, but that's about all you're going to get from it. The interesting thing is that, like, if you look at the interaction with the sand, like, it's really chaotic and over the top. And I'm kind of wondering, do they do it as like a liquid sim with like high viscosity or something? Like, it's kind of odd, because usually this sort of thing, it doesn't actually need to be that interesting. It just needs to displace. It doesn't need to flow and do all the stuff. And I feel like with this stuff, it's kind of like someone like really kind of cranked at the detail and tried to get a lot of animation in there. So it's just interesting, like the subtle stuff that really needs, it just needs to be simple. And I feel like someone kind of tried to make something really over the top with it. And it doesn't matter, like, it looks great, you don't pick up on it. It's just when I'm actually looking, you know, I'm looking around like, okay, CG or practical. And the first thing that really kind of captures my eye is the sand is feeling wrong to me. It's way too animated in a lot of areas. And like I said, this is me going frame by frame, because I'm totally not disrespecting the artists who worked on this, because it actually looked really spot on. Like, when you watch this as a sequence, it's like, yeah, this works. And the quick cuts and everything about it, what really makes the shot is that you're not really fixating on anything for too long. So I think overall this is really great. But I feel like just looking at this one shot alone, there's a bunch of stuff going on that, to me, kind of gives away. I was like, okay, yeah, this is CG. But then there's some other weird stuff. Like, you've got these bits here that kind of roll down the top of the head, and you can totally get that with CG. It just makes me think like it's such a weird thing that it's almost like this is kind of random stuff that got caught in camera, and they're like, all right, let's keep it. But I think if I were to break this down, basically the stuff that I'm talking about here, there's these droplets of blood that just kind of like fall down, like as if they're rocks or something. They just kind of like slide down the body, and they look really odd. And that's what I mean. Like, it kind of feels like if that were debris or something, then it's probably something got shot in camera. But in reality, I mean, you get that with 3D as well. It's just usually you do more of a stylized kind of like path dripping and stuff like that, opposed to doing something that is just like clean droplets that kind of just slide down it. But I'd say all of this is just completely textured, and that's why most of this blood stays fixed. And then you have this pass of CG blood on top. which I'm sure was probably requested, and that stuff kind of just like slides over kind of weird. And I think maybe it's just because you've already got blood there, they just kind of figured, okay, yeah, we'll just do a pass like this. So what's really missing is having a wet map. And a wet map is anything that the liquids, like the fluid dynamic sim, like an SPH sim, when it runs over the surface, anything it touches is then going to essentially draw a kind of like a collision map with it, where any area that it comes in contact with, it's going to then paint onto the map itself. And this is really good because that way when you have water touch concrete, for instance, as it moves along, it leaves like a wetness trail behind it, so that way it feels like there's residue, it's affecting it rather than just cleanly sliding over it. And the same thing with blood. You can have blood land on something and drip down, and you don't need to have physical drip trails. Instead, you have this contact map which will actually draw all the blood streaks and trails onto it. And because this doesn't have that, that's why I feel like this stuff, like if it was debris, rocks or something, it almost feels real, because this stuff just slides off of it and it doesn't leave a trail, it doesn't do anything. But as blood, which is what it's meant to be, I would imagine you'd have trails everywhere. And maybe they felt like because there's so much textured blood on here that it wasn't necessary. But I think what you need to do is have it where you have that pass and the two blend together. And just it makes something that is static then feel correct, because you have the static blood and then you have the live trails, making it all feel like, okay, this is all in the same world. So it's just little subtle things like that in the sand. A good example of the sand is stuff like down here. It's extremely active. It's kind of like, you'd imagine the arms is pushing through the sand, but it's got all this like really kind of micro detail in there, which I kind of feel like is unnecessary. It feels like it's basically being forced really fast, even though the arm itself isn't really doing too much there. So little things like that, even here as well, it just kind of feels like there's a lot of detail in the sim where it doesn't really need to have it. But overall, this thing looks cool. And that's all obviously CG. Oh yeah, and that's one thing I was going to mention too, is just like if you look at the wings, same kind of deal. You just don't get this sort of pattern, I feel, from having something just kind of like fall flat down, because you see it just kind of just happens so perfectly. So usually what happens is you have like a fall off map around this. Okay, so you create this kind of, I'll call it a soft selection, which is what you call a max, but same thing in anything. But what you then do is you have this selection where the area closest to it would be a 1, and the area furthest away would be a 0. I know I'm doing that off screen, but let me draw it here, is a 0. Okay, so that's kind of like how you do it, is like a distance fall off. However, you can remap the 0 and the 1 as a bell curve, so that way the furthest away, how would you do this? The way I would do it is that it's just like a straight line here. However, then you're inverting like a bell curve, basically. And so what's happening is that suddenly this becomes like 0.7 or something, and the 1 is actually still at a 0. So in other words, you get this like elevation here. It's kind of hard to explain without looking weird, but that's the sort of thing you can do where you get this kind of like elevation where you're remapping 0 and 1, so that way the elevation is perhaps further away at a certain point, kind of maps out, and then settles back down again. And so that way you get that displacement. And then you use that selection as a push to elevate everything up. It's just an easy way to do this sort of thing without needing to do much work. The other thing is just to do a straight up granular solver or a flip sim with liquids, just with a lot of viscosity, high density, friction, everything else. So that way you get something that's kind of dull, but it works. So there's a few different ways to do it, but that's ultimately how to get like that sort of interaction. And it's so important to have that interaction. And again, I wouldn't pick up on this stuff. Like, that's the important thing to understand here, is like the way that this stuff was executed is beautiful. Like, it's really well done. It's not like, oh, there's something wrong with that shot. This is literally me needing to go in and be like, yeah, now that I'm going through like this, I can start to see how all the bits and pieces work. It's very different, let's say, from let's say Army of the Dead, the opening scene, how I'm just, first time, I'm trying to watch the movie not looking at the visual effects at all, but there's certain things that just stand out as just like, that just is blatantly wrong. And, you know, as someone pointed out in the comments on YouTube, that, yeah, it's like point blank shot to the head and there's no entry wound at all, and it's just weird stuff like that. Whereas here, like, this is really well done. You've got to scrub through to kind of get it. But yeah, I mean, I don't know why the actor said this is all practical, because it's very little of it is practical. I'll mention this, like, one thing that I constantly look at is all CG sand sims as well. But one thing I constantly look at is I'm always looking at, like, let's say the actual plate, like the footage, the shadows with it, and the shadows in here. And it's pretty easy to fix this stuff in comp, just setting your black points to match the plate. But that's such a big giveaway when someone's just got like really harsh shadows in a shot that actually doesn't have harsh shadows, for instance. But all this looks really good. The blood itself is really stringy, but it's meant to be not stringy per se, but like more. It's basically really high velocity, but I mean it needs to be. But that's why I feel like you've got like a few different sims. You've basically got one particle system here, which is coming off the wheel, and it's just like super fast. Then you got another particle system here. This stuff here is then hitting the ground. There's high friction on the ground, so it stops right away, which is correct. So you'd see it doesn't slide or anything. So I think they did a really good job there. I feel like this stuff definitely has all those wet maps I was talking about. And just, yeah, overall looks really good. I feel like a lot of his face getting hit is all practical, but all this I'd say is CG as well. We talked about these shots. So what's interesting is, as I mentioned about leaving impressions and stuff, like, you'll notice it is leaving impressions, but it doesn't actually leave anything really over here, per se. Have I said per se twice? Anyway, again, like, I think this is great. I think they've done a really good job. And for something like this, it's literally just have him start a frame, grab the hat, and swing around and put it on. And it's just a matter of doing a CG one that matches up to the practical. I mean, I could be wrong, but like you kind of, I wonder if it's the lighting or what. You see there's a huge shift there, but it might just be because the angle changes, because it's now going to land in his hands. But you can see it's very different there and there. Yeah, pretty cool. So let's move on to the next one. But yeah, I thought it was interesting because I went in thinking like, oh yeah, that one's totally practical, just because I saw a headline about it, and having another look, I'm like, yeah, no. Okay, let's talk about Tsung Fatality on Kung Lao. This is pretty straightforward. It looks cool. But yeah, like basically just lots of CG makeup and particle effects. So we'll just talk about the green stuff first of all. This is pretty much just a point render pass, I should say, and it's just all it's doing is it's following a path. So what you're doing is you have like a match move here. So you have a match move of the dude's face, the hand, all that good stuff, and you need all of that because his face, as it decays, is completely CG. So you need to have an accurate face track of that, and then you're going to do kind of variations of how it gradually decays. But what you're doing is you're essentially putting a emitter in his mouth, which is spewing out his soul. And the way that you do this is you have that point, and then you'll have a path that it follows along. And what's actually interesting is I think that there's multiple points as it spreads out across the face, I guess, or however it's being done. I think they're all essentially being attracted to this one point. And then this one point follows a path over to the next area. So I'll explain a little bit further. It's just, that's what it looks like to me. Even here, you kind of see it. So there's a lot of spread. I did this exact thing for Bloodshot, if you remember that Vin Diesel movie. I haven't seen it myself. I'm friends with the director, so I paid for the movie when it came out because it went straight to streaming at the beginning of the pandemic, but I haven't actually sat down and watched it yet. But yeah, there's a lot of particle stuff that ILM was doing on that, and I helped out on some stuff doing like a lot of this kind of particulate stuff, and it's the same deal. It's kind of like essentially giving it attraction points and paths. So you have all of this going to a certain point, and at that point, you can either die or it shifts to essentially a new event, and that's when it's telling it to flow around to here. So there's a path, like a spline, that would just have a few points in it, and it's just undulating. It's just kind of like moving around. And then you have these other paths here, and you just have lots, like millions, tens of millions, a billion particles all flowing along there. And then you'll have these other kind of streaks which are less concentrated. So same sort of deal, it's just more splines doing its thing. And it just makes the whole thing feel really organic, rather than it feeling like it's just following a spline. So good example, I hate picking apart people's work. I'm happy to do it when I'm getting paid to do it, because it's for the greater good of getting the movie going. But you can see here that there's this kind of like these weird kind of curling shapes. And what's actually happening is there's an attraction point, really. So this stuff kind of overshoots and it curls back around. That's what I'm seeing. And again, I could be wrong, but you know, all I do is my forte for the last however long has always been particles and fluids, and so I've spent way too much time with this stuff. So that's why you're getting a lot of curling here, is because this stuff would have like an attraction point, and it's kind of like having a spherical Newton or something. Like if you go into Maya, let's say, you would have it go to the attraction point, then it overshoots and it loops back around. And so usually it's dying or fading off around this point. And the way that point renders work is that you have these points, and by themselves they're not even visible because they're such low density or low opacity. But it's when you put millions of them on top of each other, what ends up happening is you get these really defined kind of ghostly streaks. And the rest, like Krakatoa is a good example of this, but the rest isn't as visible, and it's because by itself it doesn't stand out, because there's more fall off, basically, because it's not as concentrated. Krakatoa, we developed like frantic films. So it's like Chris Batty, Mark Weeb, and like a bunch of other geniuses, all PhDs, multiple PhDs. They wrote, like, Krakatoa, the idea isn't that complex, but what I love is that they initially built it, and then that was used on a few films. And then for Superman Returns, like, we really beefed it up. We had like volumetrics and so much more to it, depth maps for compositing holdouts, things like that, to really kind of continue to make it stronger. And it's got better and better and faster and faster. So it's really phenomenal. So all you're doing is you got all these splines, and the particles kind of use it as a guideline of what to follow. And because the way that splines work is they have, like, they're all numbered points. So the way you put together a spline is that it follows point 0, point 1, point 2, point 3. So it kind of realizes that, okay, I got to start here, and I got to go to the next one, and next one. So it knows kind of like a typical flow path. And then if you have it fork off in a multiple, you can either base it on distance or random, or a lot of different stuff, so that as it gets close, it starts to move to the next goal that it's going for. Good example, back in the day, I don't think Maya has this stuff anymore, but I think it's called like surface flow and curve flow. But you can essentially set up paths, and using goal weighting, it's all scripted, but like you could get particles to kind of flow along paths. It couldn't do stuff like this because Maya couldn't handle the particle count, plus it was using a hardware renderer back then, but anyway, I digress. So that's typically how you do this sort of thing. So I'd imagine it's multiple splines, probably to here, and then it moves to around here, and then it's kind of moving to an individual curve. So these are kind of flowing, and then they kind of like suck back around because they're overshooting. In terms of all this, again, you're just getting the original plate, and then you're creating like a blend mask that gradually moves along. I used to do a lot of this stuff because I was obsessed with the Mummy, and you're essentially using that to blend with the digital double, right? That's all decayed, it's all messed up and gross. And that's where you can start to see all the musculature and the fats, everything else underneath. It looks really cool, really gross, and it's all shriveled up. Now, I'd imagine you're still using that blend map to do a lot of this in 3D, but you're still going to render that out as well to control the blend and comp. But I'd imagine there's a certain amount of displacement that happens, so that way, as this stuff starts to happen, it's probably moving down under the surface a little bit. It's also blending with it there as well. So there's a bit going on. If you guys ever want me to do something like this, like I already did some, it was called Decay. That was like some free training I put out a few years ago. I can't remember the link to download it, but yeah, I mean, I've done stuff like this before. It's always really fun, but to do one that's specifically like gross like this, it could be really fun to do. I'd love to go in and just kind of recreate all of the fatalities from Mortal Kombat. So if you ever want something like that, let me know. So yeah, just points following along, doing their thing. Because you can see here, these are all moving up to this point, and then it kind of stops there, and it starts this new curve. And that's why I feel like there's, I'm drawing with my mouse right now, but hopefully this works. You kind of feel like it's kind of shifting from one curve to the next. Again, could be wrong, but I don't think I am. And so I think all that blood in his face is all real, but then you can start to see hints of the blending as the face starts to decay from the nose and roughly around the cheeks. And that's where you can see there's like multiple other curves going around here and stuff, and that's just, I think, to make it a bit more interesting, so that way it's just like not coming straight out of his mouth, but it's going from like anywhere. You can see it's coming out of his ears as well, stuff like that. It's pretty cool. And then all the veins and everything on top. I'd imagine, like, it's not that hard to do this stuff practically, but I always feel like, maybe because it's more progressive or something, but I always feel like that's all digitally added most of the time. And it's not really that difficult to, these days, to pull something like that off. I mean, a lot of the time you can just use Nuke's smart vectors and just kind of create like a vein map and then project that onto the face. You could do some stuff like that, but I'd imagine they've done like a match move and gone the more complicated route, but just because you need that for the holdouts, so it goes into his mouth and everything, so why not use that? And then that's kind of like the fully decayed face there. Yeah, I think that's the last we see of it. So you can see there's a little bit of subtle compression happening still around the face, that way it's just not static. Because you could totally do this as progression phases, so that way you just kind of, each time it cuts to him, you're doing different makeup, or you end up with a dummy. But that's where I feel like here it's just CG, and it's just kind of blending. But here's another example where you can see all this kind of build up, it's all getting to that point, and then it's going to the next curve. So I mean, obviously that's like meant to represent his soul, but I still feel like that's kind of the center point where a lot of this kind of flows over to the next part. Okay, so I thought I'd include this, probably the dumbest fatality of all, the gnome in the face. And I had to bump up the brightness because it's a little dark. Yeah, I don't really know what to say here. This is a CG gnome, so she would have just been holding something and they tracked in a gnome. And that way you can, I forget the term, it's been a while since I've had to rig anything, but essentially like a joint IK constraint that you can blend between 2 points, so that way you can animate it on her hand and you switch the constraint to then be parented to like a vert for his eyeball or something, and that way it's just attached, so like wherever his head moves, it's attached to as well. Pretty straightforward to do, but and then you have like the CG blood splat out and everything. You never really see hit the ground or anything, but whatever. Yeah, there's that. So I thought this was pretty cool and worth talking about. I really like his arms. I thought they did a really good job on those. What I liked about this was actually there's a progression. So it isn't just like punch, 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 and then thunderclap, which again is so freaking cool. There's actually a progression where punch him in the face, the CG blood, but they've also kind of like added a lot of bruising. You can see it there, like that they've added all this extra stuff to his face. And then again, feel like this is probably the most violent, maybe I'm wrong here, but like the most violent fatality out of all of them. And then we got the big thunder clap, sorry, that I think in Mortal Kombat 2 he does that, or at least is one of his moves. So what's interesting is this is pretty much, I mean, you just get the head model you've got, and they've actually done their own controlled cuts, because usually people just do like a Voronoi sim or something and it looks really kind of cheesy, but I feel like they've actually gone and made their specific cuts. That way it feels like everything's kind of cracking without it being too many pieces, right? Because that would look silly. Cracking from the tension point, so it's, whereas hands are, it kind of cracks out like that. And that's going to give you all the big chunks that you want. So I think it's the right way to do it. So then you just have like those pieces explode. And what you're going to do is just have essentially in the same areas that you've cut, you're also using them to emit blood spurts initially, but then you're going to do a secondary one, which is just filling this up with blood inside that just shoots out in a few different directions. I've done kind of like, so that way it's not too omnidirectional. I mentioned this in one of the other visual effects breakdowns that I've actually got a course specifically on how to do these head explosions, just because it's so fun to do all the gunk inside, like the brain matter, as well as all the liquid, and then the exterior sides of it all. So it's pretty much just like a rigid body sim on the outside, and then like a flip sim, like an SPH sim of all the other liquids. So what's interesting here is I feel like they've actually gone the reverse, which is a pretty cool idea. Like this is actually a really cool idea, because any kind of shots like this, me personally, I would make sure we've got storyboarded out. We know exactly what we want to do, pre-vised it, so that way we can have a real conversation about how do we go about it, rather than saying, okay, head explodes, well clearly we'll go CG. I think they made the right calls here, where half of this shot is CG, but which half is it? So what I feel, unless it's all practical and they're blended together, I feel that they've gone and done a CG body here, and then you end up with a practical, really gross body here. Now, again, could be wrong, but that's what it feels like to me, where because you could do just practical and then another practical take there and blend them together. It's a bit of a risk. It's easier to match move and go for a clean here, CG here. But this look, because this sort of stuff, like getting this to look 100% like how it looks here is pretty difficult to do. It's not to say you can't do a shot like this, it's just more some of the subtleties that have been done here. I just don't think that this is CG. Either way, it looks really great. The subtleties I'm talking about is having some of that meat submerged more under the blood, so that way it kind of looks a different color here. There's a few different things like that, and then just having all the stuff grouped up around it. I mean, you could totally do a CG, I just feel like... Yeah, I just feel like a lot of this is live action. Again, could be wrong. But if that's the case, then I'd assume that this is where they just had a lot of crap fall down all over his shoulders, and they just kept that take. But then in the beginning, it's like, okay, well, let's just kind of roto around the blood as much as we can, and there's a lot of CG blood all spewing out. But it's all clean there, basically it's like 3D, but then you're blending to the gross take there. Again, like, could be wrong about that, but like I feel like that's actually a really smart call. Is it Chris Godfrey who was the VFX super for this? I think it was Chris, yeah. So I mean, he's ex-Animal Logic. He's one of the founders, or at least he helped run the studio for quite a long time, back when it was in Crow's Nest, and then I think Building 54 over at Fox Studios. I don't know whether they're still there now, but they were the only soundstage there. In fact, like we were setting up a visual effects studio at Fox Studios, and contractually we're not allowed to be on the studio a lot because Animal had negotiated that they could be the only visual effects house. So instead, we're I forget what the term was, we're a Warner Brothers visual effects consulting thing or something like that. But basically, I was helping set up a studio at Fox Studios in Sydney, an American-Canadian studio, but we couldn't call ourselves a visual effects studio because Animal Logic then could get really mad at Fox Studios and everything. So we're Warner Brothers VFX consulting or something. So here what's interesting is there is a bunch of blood coming off that's all CG. You just tell by the movement and how it acts, but like, you know, it works. So just having him there, I'm sure they would have been like, hey, like, let's just get, for continuity's sake, let's add some blood from the previous shot. But yeah, I feel like that's all practical. That's potentially all CG. Otherwise, they could do shoots like of 2 takes and pray that they blend together. I feel like that's too big a risk. It would just make more sense to do a clean one. And then all the crap falling down is all CG. Like all the blood here, because the whole point is that it's a transition mask. All the CG elements are there to help transition to the to the practical. Probably my favorite fatality.
Choose your destiny.
So I haven't heard anyone talk about this, but, you know, as in, I'm assuming this is meant to be an animality, which I think Mortal Kombat 3 had. I said I was obsessed with Mortal Kombat. That was Mortal Kombat 1 and 2. Mortal Kombat 3 came out where they had like guys with guns and like random stuff, and it's just like, this isn't a fighting game when you have like people with machine guns and robots and all this crap. So I just I still love Mortal Kombat. I'm still more obsessed with the first 2 than anything else. As you can see, I've got Doom right behind me, and I got some custom-made Doom art as well, just because it was Doom and Mortal Kombat and Prince of Persia were probably the big 3 things that really had an influence on me. And the cool thing is that, not so much Mortal Kombat, but Doom, I'm friends with all the guys involved in Doom now, and I've known like John Carmack, John Romero, Tom Hall, like Kevin Cloud. There's so many guys that of that generation of the original Doom that I've met multiple times, I've spoken on stage with, and that's always been really fun as well. Prince of Persia, I'm friends with Jordan Mechner. So it's kind of fun just having that childhood. Even with Command & Conquer was the other one, and that Lewis Castle, as well as a few of the other guys these days I know, having grown up with these things, it's so cool that I get giddy about that stuff. It's like, oh my god, like I'm friends with these people who, as a child, I looked up to, which to me I feel really honored about. So I haven't really looked at this too much, but I'm assuming that this is meant to be an animality, which in Mortal Kombat 2 was just a rumor that there was nudalities where they're naked, which was just a rumor, obviously, but there was also animalities, which were a rumor, but then they actually implemented them into the game. And Ed Boon and John Tobias, like they did that a lot. They listen to fans and implement stuff. So let's just talk about the stuff. I'm just going to watch it one more time because I haven't actually looked at this yet. So it's a very similar approach to how the Shang Tsung stuff was done. So let's talk about this really quick. I guess like I'm trying to get in the habit of saying what I would do rather than just talk about like what I think they did. But I guess with this stuff, I'm just kind of more going that route. But all you're doing is you're hand tracking his hands, so that way you have occlusion models that you can use as mats to get the fire to interact with, and also occlude it, so that way it's just not sitting on top of the footage. But also as an illumination pass, so that way you can't really see it, but the hands will be illuminated. You can see it there. They're quite illuminated. Sometimes you might actually use like LEDs. Like I've got, just so that way I look all pretty on camera, I've got like LEDs like this. You can actually set these to like pulsate or program them however you want. And it's becoming a lot more popular now because they're so controllable. They don't get hot and they're quite small, to just use LEDs for a lot of stuff to get that interactive lighting. But doing this stuff in just purely in 3D isn't that big a deal, or in comp as well. So that's all they're doing, is you just got like the hands match moves, so that way they match all that for the lighting, for the fire sim potentially, and also for the fire itself to actually like get rendered behind and in front of as well. And all you're doing then is you're just getting these points and having fire emitting out of them. It's not that big a deal to do something like that. I feel like sometimes like people's fire has way too much turbulence because everyone thinks more turbulence is better for some reason. So I kind of feel like some of these, like the fire, is a little bit too turbulent. But my rule of turbulence is always the more turbulence, the more magic it is, and the less real it is. And maybe, you know, this is meant to be more magical, so that's forgivable. So one thing I'll mention is, like, I mean, I'm sure for most of us this is pretty obvious, but you got handles or heads and tails, usually handles. So that means that, like, let's say this is the clip. You would usually have 12 frame handles on either side. So there's 24 extra frames you're working with. And it means that in the edit, they can slip the edit either way if they need to. And so it's always good to have handles. Some studios I've worked at have like 24 or 48 frame handles, which is freaking ridiculous because sometimes you'll work on shots that are a lot smaller and the handles are actually a lot longer than the actual shot. And then you get creative comments like, well, I want it to start here and I want it to end there. And in reality, it's just like, well, no, like you can choose a start point or an end point because you're not going to see both because what's actually in the shot is probably this much. And you're making comments along this whole timeline. And that's the problem, is the longer the frame handles, the more people are making comments about stuff that isn't even, you know, you're not going to be able to see in there. So I mentioned that just because there's another thing which is pre-roll. And pre-roll means that, again, if you have your timeline, let's just say you get like a smoke column of smoke billowing out from like a ship. Pretend it's a really bad ship. A ship at sea. You're not just going to start frame one and it's just like the fire is automatically there. It's obviously got to billow up over time to get to that point. So you might end up having like 200 frame pre-roll, just so that way the smoke can get to that point, and then you can start your timeline and have it kind of like shifting a little bit, like have some more animation added to it. So I mentioned that just because at the beginning of this frame, obviously, you know, the fire isn't turning on, the fire is turning on here. So by here, in these shots, and again, like, tell me, like, I know this, for most of us, we're going to know this, but just based on the comments, I figure some of this stuff not all of us are aware of, so I figured I'd mention it. But sometimes you get the, you know, the 12 frame handles I mentioned, but let's say the hand went from here to here, but we meant to pretend it went further. So sometimes we actually got to go and create our own animation curve, so that way the hand is doing a bit more, because otherwise it's just going to sit there and we're going to get like this much flame. So we got to actually go and animate, and this is why usually these days at studios in production we'll start at frame 1000, and then we'll go to like frame 1034 if it's a 30 frame shot, and then from there we'll deduct the handles, and then you realize like, holy crap, I'm working with 15 frames. But the whole point is that if you were starting at frame 0 and you need a pre-roll, you're going to need to start going negative. And it sucks if the director comes back and they're like, hey, we're slipping the edit, so we've gone and retract everything. You don't need to now shift all your stuff. Just go back an extra 50 frames and start the sim there. And it's like, well, now I'm going negative 50, and then suddenly you're rendering that out and then going to comp, and comp might start at the new timing, but then people are like, hey, at 8 frames in, do this. And it's like 8 frames, it's negative 42. Okay, like it just becomes this huge mess to think about. And so because of that, if you start at frame 1000, if you needed to go back 50 frames, you just go to frame 950. It doesn't really affect anything. It just means that when you render everything out, you might start at 1000, but when it goes into comp, they'll just do a time offset. So all your elements, anything coming from 3D, will have this time offset of negative 1000. So it all starts at 0. Hopefully that all makes sense. And that's what you would be doing, so that way you could slip it all. And I mention all this just because I feel like the hand probably started here, and it moves all the way around to here. And same thing, the other hand comes from here. So you could assume that maybe the plate animation and match move probably starts in these two spots. So you've got to go back and animate extra frames. I mention all that just in case you have a second guessing yourself, like, hey, the animation isn't there, what do I do? You know, just go and add some extra curves in, because typically, as long as it starts on the correct frame and follows through, you can get all that extra pre-roll to get the animation to do what it needs to do. Because that's another thing. A lot of times animators and everyone will animate everything for the shot, and they're not thinking about for the simulation. And that screws you because you might need that pre-roll. And then you can go do it, but you know, maybe it's not going to 100% line up, or there's no motion blur. Like your motion blur gets jacked up because suddenly your stuff is moving pre-frame 0, but then on theirs it isn't, you know, this, or it's doing something different. There's just stuff like that. It's best to communicate to modelers about anything that you need to destroy. It's best to communicate to animators about anything that you need to simulate. And that way they're in the know, and they might do like 100 frames of pre-roll. So that way everyone's animation lines up 100%. So anyway, all you're doing is you've got emitters on the hands pretty much, and you're just moving them around. And you got this cool looking fire. And so that's just all straight up match move. And I'd say they match moved his whole body. And it's typically what studios will do. They'll give you like a prefab model half the time that doesn't match the actor, and it just matches the body as much as possible. One thing, I'll just mention this about tracking, because I've got, for this it's fine, but there are times where I've hired trackers that just did a painfully bad job, where what they'll do is they're matching to the silhouette, because they're thinking as long as it matches to the silhouette, we're good. The problem is the textures are not locked to it. So there's basically everything's sliding around everywhere. So if you were to, let's say, add in, let's just say you do like a wound on his arm. Suddenly this wound is sliding all over the place because all they did is they match moved to the silhouette. They didn't actually match move the model, so everything's locked. So there's a few good ways to do that. Sometimes just doing a 2D track, like an automatic track first. That way is actually taking stuff into 3D, and then you can do a 3D match move from there, just using that as reference. There's a few things you can do just to kind of like have something to work with. But usually what I'll do is I'll end up creating a few kind of like markers on the 3D model that just comp on. So that way I can see like if there's slippage, then it's like, okay, that's because the model itself is not actually staying accurate to what the actual body is doing. So I feel like match moving is getting better and better these days, but that's something that's kind of frustrating. That's where I'm actually excited about AI. Like I don't want it to take everyone's jobs, but there's certain things that just a computer is going to do a way more accurate track, like accuracy wise than anything. So you can see here that you basically have like a shape, and it's pushing the fire down, and it's actually pushing up out of it and billowing all around. I mean, it looks good, it works. Good CG reflections. I like the touch of blue, because usually the blue is such a subtle thing, but it always makes it feel real, even though this is technically like propane or gas when you're introducing like the blues and everything in there. But it's such a subtle thing, but it really, yeah, I can definitely appreciate it. So just to talk about this stuff, like I said, it's just you're emitting from the hands, then you get down to here. This is where you'll have like an initial shape here, and you're just doing a quick burst. And the burst is like a one pass, and just creates this big burst of fire. And it's a good way to kind of transition from one emission to the other. So you have a quick burst of fire, and then that burst dies out, and that's where you have the next pass of fire, which is actually spreading. And I feel like the way that they've done this is, or at least how I would do something like this, you could have just emitters following paths along, but I feel like with something like this, what I would do is I would create a texture map or something that emits crap loads of points. And then what I would do is I would actually just have a shape that just expands out, and as it does, it's activating all of these. So they activate and create this emission, so that way all the fuel is then emitting out, which catches on fire. And then you have this other pass down here, which is more defined, and this is part of the initial burst kind of shape. So that way all you're doing is you're, again, this is personally how I would do it. I would have this shape, this is populated with points, and then you would have just like a couple of areas on here actually activate. So in other words, if you got like a noise pattern inside of the shape and you emitted based on like the white areas of that, what ends up happening is you would get a shape, but then the noise pattern would create like pockets of black and white. So you could say only emit from the blue or whatever, and that way you're just getting some pretty interesting shapes. And if you want to change it, you just up the size and the whole, or change the threshold of white and black, and that way it'll fill out more or get more sparse, whatever you want it to do. And I assume that's all CG fire as well. I'd imagine, I mean, it's just easy to say we'll just do this stuff practical. But I feel like this stuff down here is all CG just because it really fits in the same family as all this other fire. What's interesting though is all this stuff out here I feel is practical, and that's why it's blown out. And I was mentioning that on the Army of the Dead VFX breakdown, how the opening sequence I mentioned, you had CG fire and then you had live action fire, and the live action fire is a lot smaller than the big CG fire, but the live action fire was way more blown out. And that's where I feel like a lot of this, you can kind of tell the difference between what's real and what's practical. So I feel like all of these torches are real. Everything else, including all the fire up here, is all practical. I feel like they matched a lot of this stuff though in this shot. Like, hey, you know what? These are all blown out. Let's blow these out a little bit. But you're always wrestling with that, because then what can happen is that you end up losing a lot of detail, and so you know, even though it's real or accurate, you're like, no, we want to keep the detail. So even with stuff like this, you'll notice that it doesn't blow out to white, whereas this stuff does. And I was talking earlier about what I'll usually do is I'll sample the most in shadow points as my black points to get my plates to match. It's kind of the same thing with fire, that you want to get the widest. If you have any fire in the shot, I want to sample the brightest points of the fire and use that for this. But this is one of those gripes that I have with CG, is that you don't want to lose all the detail and blow it out to white, so then you pull it all back. And this is typically called a soft clip, and it's a way to kind of retain a lot of detail, because I think it's more of a gradual, you know, lowering the curve, so that way nothing blows out, and it kind of retains a lot of detail, but it still stays within, you know, a nicer range, doesn't blow out to white. So that's what's happening here, is this is blowing out essentially to white, but they've got a soft clip on there, so it stays smooth and has a lot of range to it instead of actually getting to white. So to do something like this, you pretty much just have a 3D model of a dragon, and you're going to model this. You're not going to do some like cheap cardboard cutout. You're actually going to create like a cool, interesting 3D model, and then you're going to put a noise map over this again to emit from certain areas. Because if you just said create fire all over this, and this is, again, I see people do this all the time, you end up with a big blob. Because first of all, fire expands, so fire is going to want to expand out, and the more you do it, the more it's all overlapping all over each other. So you end up wanting to create just like pockets of fuel everywhere and heat, and all of those, they end up looking like they're very detailed, but it's usually just pockets. What I would usually do is I would have two passes. I would have one that is like those residual, like individual flames, and that way you're getting these longer areas. But then I would have another pass which is actually a lot more tame, and it's more just filling everything out. So that way you get continuity, there's no negative space. And then you're adding the two together. So that way you have like the small flames, they're kind of filling everything out. And then you're gonna have the bigger flames on top of that to make this look like, you know, it's consistently burning everywhere. And then same thing on the ground, just like lots and lots of points to distribute fire all over the place. And then finally, for the actual dragon, I would render it. I wouldn't actually just keep the flame pass. I would actually go and render this as a fall-off map. And the reason for a fall-off map is that it's kind of like the X-ray look. You're just going to get like the edges to show up, and they gradually fall off. But what you're doing is you're using that, you're adding it back into comp, and what it will do is it will kind of add back in definition, so that way you'll have all the flames and everything else, but you'll still have this defined 3D model inside of it. And then finally, you're doing a heat distortion over all of this. And sometimes you can actually just use like the blue or green channel, which won't be as strong as the red channel for fire, and use that as a heat distortion, or do a custom pass, however you want to do it. And then finally, for stuff like this, I mean, you could do it in comp, or you'd have a 3D model and just say that those areas are hotter. And it's partially just because like we all recognize faces, so just while you're like, what the hell is this? I was going to cover my hand over this, but obviously that doesn't do anything. I've done live reviews with my mentorship where people are actually pointing at the screen, and I've got to remind them, like, dude, I can't see your finger when, you know. But like, if we were to, just hear me out here, but if I were to paint all of this out, you're not going to know this is a dragon. Okay, like instantly taking the eyes and the mouth away, it just looks like, okay, what's this big crap of fire that we're looking at? And that's why it's so important to reintroduce the eye and the mouth back into it, because it helps you understand instantly, like, okay, there's a freaking dragon there. And then obviously same thing here. So you can kind of see what I mean. Like, this is obviously like a fall off pass over everything. Then you have your fire passes on top of it all. And then you're getting the teeth and the eyeballs and insides of the nostrils to blow out. And I'd imagine to be able to see the teeth, they decided not to do the inside of the mouth because it just, you know, obviously makes it all flat again. So I do like what they're doing here. So it feels like there are points on here. And it feels like the points are actually moving downward, because you can see there's this big velocity curl that's happening. So I feel like what's actually happening is you're getting the UVs and you're shifting them down the model. Because you imagine, like, the dragon, the way it's going to be modeled is pretty much going to be, this is horrible, but let's just say that there's the mouth and it's just going to be a long tube. And so because of that, you do like your mapping and just have it move down. And all you're doing is then it's going to curve down here. But with something like this, like, what that's going to do is you could give it some velocity. So as long as the emitters are following and inheriting the velocity, what's actually happening is the fire is actually going to be traveling down, but then you have the buoyancy making it move up. So what you get is you have this nice kind of curl happening here, which is kind of neat. So I think that is kind of cool, because it makes it feel like there's more going on with it rather than just the whole thing's just on fire, right? And so that's like a really subtle thing, but I feel like that just makes it look really neat. The wings are kind of crazy. Like I said, 3D model for all this stuff, and then the fire laid on top. Then you got this guy, same thing on fire. I'd say that's CG as well for this side. I think on the other side they're all live action. I think for over here they're CG. And then this is all practical, so they just lit a guy on fire and it made him move around. I think that's a smart choice, just to help you just get away from like what you've been staring at this whole time. Like, there's a close-up, why not just go and cover this guy in gel and light him on fire. I feel like this last shot here, as he kind of collapses down, I feel like there's a pass of fire. Yeah, I could be wrong, but like I feel like there's like a kind of like a spread out pass of fire on top of the practical, just to kind of make that a bit more interesting. So as he kind of like falls down into the water, you get that splash. But again, I could be wrong about this stuff. It's difficult with stuff like this because it is so polished, and at the same time they're quick cuts. So it's, unless like something blatantly looked wrong, like you got to be really careful, like looking through it all to kind of distinguish, like, oh yeah, that's practical, and you know, whereas like there's like, I feel like a pass just right here of CG flame. Really cool.
Flawless victory.
Okay, so let's talk about Sonya's ring fire stuff. I got so many mixed feelings about this film. Like, I'm not gonna go on a big rant. I'll stick to the visual effects, but yeah, I think there's certain things that could have been left out of this film, and her magic ring stuff, like, I feel like just doesn't really fit too well. So I'd imagine for a lot of this stuff, like I mentioned before about having LEDs that do some interactive lighting for you. I'd imagine that she would have some kind of like wrist guard on that's covered in LEDs. Again, could be wrong, but I would totally request that, because I know that these are going to light up. I know they're close to her face, so why not have it all splash on there? I personally would do that, and I would just fix it to the timing that we're going for. A lot of lens flares in here. So it's interesting that they're actually trying to track these to the little rings that are going on. This is basically just a mixture of particles, fluids, and then hard geometry. So if you were to look at these, like this is just all rings, like literally just keyframed rings, and they go through her body. So she's match moved here. They're also a light source, so that way you get some interactive lighting. And I guess like as it's hitting, there's some kind of a bit of expansion, like a little shockwave to help make it feel like it's hitting. I think it's kind of tricky because you're like, there's such quick cuts, and it's also just kind of really crude geometry. So to kind of get some kind of way to show it feeling like it's actually hit, they're doing a bunch of like shockwave effects, stuff like that, to make it feel like it's interacting. And then you're painting in like a clean pass of the plate behind her. It's funny because like just none of the stuff you actually see. And yeah, they're totally just trying to track it to the abdomen. She moves so quick that you're not really going to tell. But then from there, it's just doing lots of CG sims of blood behind her, splashing on the ground. So it's interesting that like even though all the effects are off at this point, the lighting is still flickering purple from, you know, on both this guy and on her as well. And it's just a fluid sim. And with this stuff, this is just all particles. I think emitting off the geometry, and you got your blood sim, and you've got the 3D track, so you're just adding the CG spine and the clean pass in there. So I never really paid much attention to her mouth, but you got the CG tracked mouth. Like there's some matte lines right there. Anyway, it works. And that's what I mean. I feel like there's just like these LED strips on her wrists. So you can just turn them off. And yeah, like you just paint the arms in.
Choose your destiny.
So I thought this was pretty awesome. I'm just gonna play through it really quick. So I thought this was really well done. I also just, me personally, I think like doing anything like this where you have like 4-armed creatures. Same thing with like intelligent tentacles. I just think, both from an animating perspective, I've always thought like, it's got to be pretty hard to animate because you've got to give thought and intent behind all their arms, not just their bipedal arms. So how I imagine they're doing this is they have a person, I'm just going to draw like, this is a really badly drawn person. So I'd imagine like you've got a person acting things out. Thing is that I'm going to do it like this, but here's their arms. But then what you're doing is you probably have like a helmet or something on, which is representing the eye line to be up here. So that way they know like, okay, clearly this is Goro, you know, up here. And so these other arms are going to be animated after effects, but you'd assume that this dude's arms are going to be roughly based on like what the actor himself is doing. That's like the worst drawing in the world. I'll make it an NFC. But yeah, I'd imagine like when you have Goro like this, you're basically focusing on the bottom arms being the talent, who's, you know, in a blue or green suit, and then you have the top arms and the head actually just like a dummy head representing the eye line, and then you would have the top arms just kind of keyframed. I mean, the whole thing would be keyframed, but kind of matched roughly to what the other actor is doing. But you take a liberty with this. I'd imagine that you're pretty much just animating this based on the performance you want to get keyframed. So I thought this is cool. Again, something like this you could just do as morph targets. So you initially have everything closed up for the shot, that section, and then what you're doing is you're just animating another version, or sorry, you're you're modeling another version where it's completely open, and then you either use morph targets or a wrap deformer to just pull everything back, and then you're doing a fluid sim to get like blood spilling out here. And by the way, I'll just mention this, like when you're doing a lot of these blood sim stuff like that, like you're not always using the actual rendered geometry. Like you're usually using dummy geometry, which just kind of roughly represents like what it needs to collide with. Because all you're trying to do is get this pass to simulate correctly, and then you take the actual rendered geometry, or the actual geometry, and you put it into the final render. So it doesn't need to actually use the real geo. And when you have something like this, all you're doing is you're having a contact point, and you're animating that up, and then you're just emitting blood out. So it's not like, because again, just for anyone who's not familiar with blood, like with doing this sort of stuff, it's not like you're opening the wound and pushing blood through. You're just animating spurts of blood shooting up as one pass. Then you've got the wound actually opening up, which would probably be done by animation, and then you got a fluid sim of blood spilling out as another pass. Another blood sim, and he's missing his hand at this point. There's blood coming out from that. I don't realize he gets it so bad. So he gets his throat slashed and then punched in the eye with a tonfa, with like a bladed tonfa or something. And so something like that, like again, you're basically got your eye line of like where it needs to go, and it's more about communicating to the talent, like keep still, like keep this still. Because if you were to be wobbling your hand around, then someone's going to need to figure out like, well, how do we keep this static? Because the more it wobbles, the more that like you're not going to be able to get the stay, so it ends up becoming, let's reanimate their arm. And not to be picky, but I feel like that's what happened here, is that he doesn't actually have a weapon at all. And so it's just like go and punch, and then we'll do the rest. So it's just like do a straight punch. Because you see his hand just like goes right through the handle at that point. It's not like it he actually lets go of the handle or anything. So yeah, I'd say that he was just directed to do like a straight punch with it and keep it aligned with wherever it connects. And then from there, they're going to add in 3D weapon, as well as, you know, the 3D Goro. And you got like, it's just interesting, like all the subtleties here, because you've got CG character, you've progressively added blood splatters too, but then you have the throat slash. So you got sim blood from there, you got blood coming from the hand. So these are all separate sims. And then you have, I'm assuming there's probably an exit, yeah, you can't really see it, but there's an exit amount of blood there. And then you see it spill out of his eyeball, which is a nice touch. And I thought this was brilliant. So like doing something like this, I mean, you could hand animate it to an extent, but you'd probably do like a soft body for it, and it's just having the intestines. Like you even do a rope sim if you really wanted to, but I'd say it's like a soft body sim, as well as just keyframed for a lot of it. You see it spilling all out, and then doing the liquid sim on top. I thought it was a nice touch, just adding the blood on the impact. Just again, things that are interacting with the ground are just going to help tie everything together. And stuff like the body, by the way, like the way you'd animate this is he's completely naked, except for the shoes, and then you're doing cloth sims around everything, so that way all of this just interacts and does what it needs to do accurately. Okay, so this is a bit of a different one, doing specifically just the fatalities, but I thought it'd be fun to dig into them, and then we're going to get into doing like the Sub-Zero fight at the end, as well as the Scorpion opening sequence, because again, like just talking about how to do big battle sequences with people with weapons and blood, as well as, you know, magic effects is going to be another one. We're going to get into a lot of different stuff, but I thought I'd just cover some of the fatalities specifically. Let me know if I missed out any fatalities, and if so, maybe I can work them into the later videos. I think I got them all, but maybe I didn't. So let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you guys, but hopefully you found this valuable. Hopefully there's a couple of things you learned. As always, like let me know, like, am I going too slow? Do you want me to like either do these faster, or do you want me to, you know, skip out, like, you know, Allan, like why are you explaining handles? Like why are you explaining, you know, what fall off is or half the stuff I'm doing that because some of us aren't familiar with that stuff. But it doesn't mean that all of us, want to hear about that. So I mean, if a majority of us are like, just skip all that, stick to the advanced stuff, I'm happy to go way more advanced with a lot of this. But at the same time, like I want to try to make this kind of broad for everyone as well. So hopefully you got a lot from this. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back with part 2 and we'll keep moving on from there. I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll be back tomorrow with the next part in the series. Each week I plan to review a different film and share as many insights as I can with you. And if there's a particular movie that you want to see, leave a comment below and let me know. Or if there's any big questions not answered in this video that you would like to see covered, let me know as well. I'd love to hear from you. Creating these videos weekly is a lot of work, but I love sharing and I love helping creators like you. All I ask, if you want to support this channel as well as ensure I can create more of these videos, is if you could please subscribe to this channel, as well as feel free to spread the word to others about these videos. As I said, it mightn't mean much to you, but it'll mean the world to me. And you won't miss out on any of the upcoming videos that I'll be putting out daily. This has been an absolute pleasure. All the content I make for free, so that way we can all get a better understanding of the visual effects process and the filmmaking process as well. Finally, one last thing, I recently released a free course on how to raise your prices and land your dream clients as an artist. I've been in the industry for over 25 years, both as an artist as well as a manager, hiring artists and managing them and of course paying them as well. So I'm very familiar with this topic. For me, it's a pet peeve that people say that there's no money in art, that art's not a career, or art doesn't pay. I want to eliminate the starving artist mindset for good. That's why I've created this 8-hour free course on everything I know about how to price yourself as an artist and how to raise your prices and land your dream clients that are willing to pay you what you're worth. At least for now, this course is completely free to download, so get the entire 8-hour free course at pricingclass.com or click the link in the description below to check it out there as well. And if you like this video, I've put another video somewhere above me that I think you're going to like as well as a link to the playlist for all the visual effects breakdowns I've created, so that way you can absorb all of those too. I'm Allan McKay, thanks for watching.